now that we know a little bit more about bacteria and viruses and things that can be pathogenic, although again, a lot of times they don't cause disease, the question is, how does our body defend against that type of pathogenic invasion? And so typically, anytime you see a microbiology course or something like that, you're also going to have a piece about the immune system of animals like us. And so the human immune system is super duper complex, involves a number of different cells and different proteins and different signaling or communication systems between cells. So we're going to try to boil this down to the most important pieces. Learn the basic cells, learn the basic approach to protecting your body from infection. And this is obviously a very hot topic right now as we are at home in the face of this potential infectious disease outbreak. So, the immune system is broken into two big parts. You've got your innate immune system or your innate immunity, and you've got your adaptive immune system or your adaptive immunity. Now, innate immunity actually has a number of names. Kind of depends on the book you look at. Sometimes innate immunity is called natural immunity. Sometimes innate immunity is called non-specific. And these are all really good names for this because innate immunity is your protection that you are born with. And so that's what innate means, right? Is born in. So this is present at birth, and this will defend your body from any and all invaders, hence non-specific, right? Anything that might potentially cause you harm, your innate immune system will defend against. Now, on the other side, you've got your adaptive immunity. Now, adaptive is sometimes referred to as acquired or specific immunity. And again, these are good names for this as well because adaptive immunity develops over time or adapts and must be acquired. And it defends against specific invaders that the body has previously identified. So this is a very interesting concept and one that we're going to talk about a little bit in terms of, viral infection like we're looking at right now. So before we get into too much here, let's talk about the players, right? We need to get into what types of cells are involved. And I think a lot of you guys already know that your white blood cells, medically referred to as leukocytes, are your immune system cells. I think that's something that maybe comes up in a previous class or whatever, or you've just heard that before. But we're going to break that down even more. So white blood cells can really kind of come in three different types or groupings. The first grouping are called granulocytes, and these a lot of times I refer to as the phils, because all their names have that in it. So there's neutrophils and eosinophils and basophils. And these are actually the majority of your white blood cells that are circulating in your bloodstream. I can't remember if these actually have come up this year or not, so maybe we'll ignore that remember us. In the past, they usually came up at some point in first semester, but I don't really think they did for us this year. Now, the second grouping and the second most common are called the lymphocytes. And you've potentially heard of these before, maybe not. And these are the B cells and the T cells. And then the least common thing that we see are called monocytes or macrophages. Now, these guys are phagocytic. And we did talk about that at the very start of the year. This means that they do endocytosis, which means they basically can engulf other things. And in this case, we're talking about a cell that will engulf invaders. So this guy's kind of like Pac-Man, right? In that if you've got little bacteria or something in your system, they will eat that and destroy it. And this all has to do about where you find it. So monocytes are found in your bloodstream, while macrophages are found out in other tissues. But it's essentially the same cell, just depends on where you're located in the body. Now here's a nice breakdown of the immune system, at least at our level. Again, we've got our two big branches, which is the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. If we look at the innate immune system, the innate system involves really two things, which are physical barriers, as we'll talk about in a moment, and defensive cells. And then defensive cells lead to a process called inflammation, which I'm assuming is a word you've heard before. Now, on the adaptive side of things, it also breaks down into basically two processes, which includes humoral immunity and cell-mediated immunity. So we'll get into what those two things mean. And then as you can see down here at the bottom, the humoral side of things involves B and T cells, while the cell-mediated side of things only involves T cells. So again, we'll come back to this second side here after a while. All right, let's start with innate immunity. Again, innate means born with or born in. So this is a system that protects you from birth from any and all foreign invaders. The somewhat unfortunate reality is that sometimes innate immunity even protects you from things that aren't pathogens, right? So we'll say even other things. If you're curious of what I'm getting at here, this is actually allergies. Now, there's not any questions about that or anything in our review work, but if you've ever been curious about what an allergy is an immune response, in fact, an innate immune response to something in the environment that isn't pathogenic, right? But still somewhat of a foreign substance. And so some of us have these reactions and some of us don't. So some of you have sensitivities to pollen that you're feeling right now because the trees are blooming. You have sensitivities to pet dander. You have sensitivities to foods and things like that. And that's what's going on is you're really getting this innate immune response against something that's not really pathogenic. But when any kind of pathogen enters your system, your innate immunity is your first line of defense. And so as we saw in that flow chart a minute ago, this really has two kind of wings to it. The first one here is protective physical barriers. In other words, this is a way to keep stuff out, right? To begin with, our major goal is to not let pathogens get into your body. So the biggest part of the physical barrier idea is your skin, right? Our skin, human skin, is very adaptive, I guess we could say. It's stretchy, it's thick, it's a well-sealed, waterproof covering for us. And of course, as you probably know, if you get a cut or an opening in the skin, then you have to worry about a potential infection, right? So otherwise, when your skin is solid, it protects your body and keeps things out. Now, another piece of this is mucous membranes. There are natural openings in the skin, right? Around your eyes, your nose, your mouth, genital areas, that kind of thing. And so you also have these mucous membranes there that also help to keep pathogens out. So, you want that moisture in your eyes all the time because it helps keep pathogens from getting inside you that way. But again, protective physical barrier, just trying to keep stuff out. Now, the second sort of wing of your innate immunity is some defensive cells. And basically, it's every cell we mentioned a few minutes ago except for the B and the T cells. So to start with here, we've got macrophages and monocytes, which again, these are the phagocytic cells that are kind of like Pac-Man. They eat invaders. And again, it just kind of depends on where you find the cell to give it, whatever name. But a lot of times, macrophages and monocytes will have this, what I call a Pac-Man nucleus. And so then we can, it helps us to remember that, okay, this is a cell that, would potentially eat something. But what we're saying here is not the nucleus. The whole cell would just engulf like a bacterium or a virus and destroy it. Now, then we also have the phils here, right? So we've got neutrophils, we've got eosinophils, and we've got basophils. And these are all cells, again, that are innate immune system cells. So they're non-specific. They will release enzymes, like it says here in the notes, to destroy pathogens that come into your body, and it doesn't matter what that pathogen is. So neutrophils have this, what's often called a multi-lobed nucleus. Eosinophils have these really dark red granules that you can see here. And basophils have these dark blue granules, and there's so many that you can't even really see the nucleus inside there. And all of these guys help release enzymes to help destroy pathogens. And they sort of specialize. This doesn't really matter, but eosinophils are more specifically involved in parasite removal from your body. Basophils are really important in your inflammatory response. Now, what basophils will trigger is a release of histamines. Now, you've maybe heard of histamines before because you've heard of antihistamines, which are allergy medications. But histamines are a natural release by your body to defend against any kind of infection that could happen. Now, let's delve a little deeper into this inflammation idea. So inflammation actually comes from I think it's a Greek word, which is inflammare, which means to set on fire. Now, the reason that they initially referred to this as inflammation is because it involves redness, right? Redness and warmth. So if you look at this picture of somebody with a little inflammatory response here on their arm or leg, I guess, I don't know. There's usually redness, there's usually warmth, there's usually swelling, and this is primarily due to increased blood flow to the area. That's why you get these reactions. But to bounce back to this first bullet point, it's super important here. Inflammation is a general response to tissue damage. So think about that for just a second, though. General response to tissue damage. Notice we're not mentioning infection. So if you have tissue damage for any reason in your body, you get an inflammatory response. So this could be an infection, right? This could be a bacterial infection, or this could just mean a little cut, or you banged your arm on something, or you've got a joint that's inflamed, your knee's inflamed because you've been playing a whole lot of sports and there's a lot of wear and tear there. Right, so any kind of tissue damage at all can lead to inflammation. It's not specific at all, and it's not just for infection. It just means any kind of damage. So again, what happens is that you'll have capillaries that will leak fluids. You'll get increased blood flow, and you leak fluids out into the tissue, and this is why it tends to swell up, because you've kind of got extra fluid right under your skin. And within that fluid, you are depositing millions of these cells from the previous slide. Monocytes, macrophages, the Tcells, which are there to help make sure that there's not an infection. So again, let's say that you just cut your skin, you get a paper cut, right? You will get a little bit of inflammation, which will carry a whole bunch of these cells to that area to help prevent infection. Right? If you ever watched let's talk Avengers, because that's what I'm into. Right? So Avengers Infinity War, a lot of the good guys are hunkered down in Wakanda with the Black Panther, and there's like this big force field that's keeping the bad guys out. But then the Black Panther guy, T'Challa, he decides to open the barrier in a little place so that the bad guys have to come through that opening, and all the good guys are there to try to stop them, right? That's basically what's happening. If we cut our skin, we're going to bring all the good guys to that area to help prevent those infectious agents from getting in, right? Now, also, if you watch Avengers Infinity War, there are a whole bunch of dead, bad aliens laying around this place when all is said and done. And this is basically what pus is. Now, this makes a lot of people uncomfortable to talk about pus. But this is a whitish fluid, right? It's going to contain a lot of your cells. It's going to contain a lot of dead pathogens and sort of the debris of the battlefield between your immune system cells and these bad guys, these pathogens. So while pus is kind of gross, right? It really isn't the worst thing, right? Because it is showing that your immune system is working, and most likely your immune system is preventing a broader infection. Now, uh, I would be I would get in big trouble if I didn't, you know, point out here that we're talking about, within reason. So, in other words, a controlled inflammatory response is good, but this can get out of control, right? We don't want to see inflammation spread. That's an indication that there's something wrong. So, if you cut yourself, we should see a little bit of inflammation. We expect it to puff up a little bit, be red for a day or two, and then it should go back to normal. So, just for your own purposes, if you ever have a little spot that seems inflamed, and it doesn't seem to go away, or the redness and swelling start to spread. So let's say you cut your hand and then you notice that kind of moving up your hand and even into your arm, you're starting to get more redness and things. That's definitely a time to see a doctor, because that means that you may have an infection that's starting to spread and has kind of gotten through that initial response. All right, so now we're going to move to what is really the more complicated side, but don't let that scare you, which is your adaptive immunity. Now, your adaptive response, again, has to develop over time, right? So it's generated, or it has to develop over time, and it is a specific defense system. So instead of just protecting you against anything that comes in, your adaptive response will seek out specific pathogens and destroy them. These are more like mercenaries or hitmen or something that are out there looking for a particular thing that they are supposed to destroy. And your adaptive immunity is the job of your lymphocytes, or again, your B and T cells. Now, B and T cells look like this picture. The greatest cell scientist in the world could not tell you if that was a B or a T cell. Essentially, they look identical under a microscope. The difference in these two cells has to do with their function. So they look exactly the same, but they will do different jobs. Now, lymphocytes are a key piece of your lymphatic system, which we don't talk about too much, but this is sort of a secondary fluid system along with your circulatory system. And these are named sort of accordingly. So I've got these two questions here. Where do you think B cells are generated? So to give you a second to think about that, where do you think you make a B cell? And if you said bone marrow, you are correct. All right, or just bones. So you may have already known that red blood cells are made in your bone marrow, right? But these B lymphocytes are also generated in your bone marrow. Now, what do you think, or where do you think we would make T cells? Those of you who said bone marrow, you are totally correct. So it's kind of a trick question, right? Now, the T, though, there is a reason. What T cells have to do is, after being created in the bone marrow, they move to the thymus, which is where they mature. So before a T cell actually becomes functional, it goes to the thymus, which is a tiny gland kind of in your neck. And that's why we call these T cells. Now, before we get into adaptive immunity, we have to understand one big difference between two kind of similar words. And that's the word antigen and antibody. So, most important thing to remember here, right? Antigens are foreign material. So, an antigen is any kind of biological molecule that causes an immune response. So, oftentimes these are like proteins found on the surface of a virus. So, if you've seen pictures of the coronavirus out there, they kind of look like this with these little thingies on them. These little thingies are proteins, which would be antigens, right? So it's something foreign that our body recognizes that leads to an immune response. Now that is sort of in opposition to a similar word that we make, which are antibodies. Now, antibodies are generated by your B cells. And the way I always remember this in my head is antibodies come from my body, right? But these are proteins that our B cells make that will attach to an antigen and lead to its destruction. So if you look at this picture up here, the antigens would be like these little, green balls. Maybe these are bacteria of some kind. And then the antibodies are these purple kind of Y-shaped things in this picture, which are attaching to those antigens and kind of marking them for destruction or marking them for removal from the body. Now, this is a super wordy slide. I'm going to try to go kind of quickly here, though. I put this on here. This is one of your review questions for today. We'll ask you to kind of highlight these cell types, so you'll be coming back to this slide later. B and T cells come in all different types. There's really 5 that I want you guys to recognize. When we talk about T cells, their main job is to destroy invaders and to help others. So you got really 3 kinds. You got helper T cells, which do exactly what they sound like, right? They help others. They are big communication cells in your immune response. And we'll come back in a moment and kind of put all this together too. Cytotoxic T cells, cytotoxic, right, means like dangerous to cells. These attack and destroy. So these are kind of like the warriors of your immune system. They'll go out and really destroy invaders. They're pretty cool. They release nasty chemicals. They actually physically poke holes in the membranes of pathogens and things like that. And then you've got memory T cells, which are exactly what they sound like, right? These remember an invader for later, and we'll come back to that idea here in a minute too. And then you've got your B cells. B cells, there's really just 2 types, and their main job is to produce antibodies, those proteins we mentioned on the last slide. So, those 2 types are plasma cells, which I kind of think of as like a factory, right? These guys, their job is to make antibodies that will help defend you against infection. And then memory B cells, again, that's an awful factory, isn't it? I'm just noticing. Memory B cells, much like memory T cells, are there to remember an invader that has been in the system before. All right, and then this picture just sort of summarizes this. Again, T cells can come in one of 3 different types. We can have the memories, we can have the cytotoxic cells, or we can have these helper T cells, which kind of communicate with others. Macrophages, we mentioned earlier, these are the phagocytic cells, which are really involved in both types of immunity, both innate and adaptive. And then B cells can come in that memory kind or that plasma cell kind. All right, so let's start with the first part of adaptive immunity, which is referred to as cell-mediated immunity. Now, cell-mediated immunity involves only T cells. And so what happens is a macrophage, like you see up in this picture at the top, will eat an invader, right, or engulf an invader. And then what it will do, and you don't really need the details of this picture, but what it will do is communicate with a helper T cell. And it'll like I put on here, kind of being silly, but it's sort of like, look what I found, right? So a macrophage will destroy this first bacterium that it runs into, or this first virus that it runs into. But then when it sees a helper T cell, it's like, hey, dude, look at what I found here in the body. And so a helper T cell, a lot of times for you history people, these are called the Paul Revere of your immune system. So if you remember Paul Revere, I'm not a history guy. He was the guy that rode through town and was like, the British are coming or whatever, to warn everybody. That's sort of what a helper T cell does. A helper T cell runs around and it tells everyone else that this bad guy is here, right? And so then the cytotoxic T cells, which you remember from a second ago, these are our warriors. These are the ones that actually kill invaders. They will take the message from the helper T cells and they will go out and hunt down and destroy other pathogens just like that initial one that the macrophage caught. Now, then, in the end, you have memory T cells. So these guys sort of remember the invader. They don't need to be triggered by a helper T cell in order to work. So what they're doing is they're just sort of roaming around and protecting your body after you've had that infection once before. This might sound kind of familiar. Some of you guys probably already know that there are a lot of diseases that you only get once, or that you're at least better at fighting off a second or third or fourth time. And this has to do with these memory cells that are in there. Now, the second part of adaptive immunity is called your humoral immunity. Humor meaning like a fluid, right? And so sometimes this is also referred to as antibody mediated. This involves both B and T cells in a response, but the focus here is on these B cells. Now, you make a whole bunch of different kinds of B cells. So like in this picture, we've got B1, B2, and B3 here. And what happens is if you get an invader that one of these B cells is good at fighting, then you get, this is called clonal selection, but don't worry about that. But you get a situation where you make a whole bunch of clones of that cell. Now, that particular cell is going to make a whole bunch of antibodies that will fight against an invader. So let's think about that last slide again. What we can see happen is a macrophage, which was our Pac-Man, will catch an invader, and then we said that it would communicate that with a helper T cell. Well, it can also communicate that with a B cell. And when a helper T cell gets activated, it will communicate that with a B cell. So you don't want to think about the cell mediated on the last slide and the humoral response as these things that happen in sequence. They all happen at once, right? But this is just another way that we can fight against an invader. So B cells start to multiply, right? They convert into plasma cells. All right, so these B cells convert into plasma cells, which make tons of antibodies, which help to identify and destroy that foreign antigen. And then, as always, we've got these memory B cells that are out there and will remember an infection or remember an invader another time around. So, quick story that's a little bit creepy to think about. When we had situations in the past where we went to war, so think about like World War II or something. All across the country, our government built ammunition factories, right? Big plants where they could create ammunition and weaponry to support our troops in these wars. Now, that would include a lot of places here in the Midwest. So actually just not far from where I live in Charlestown, Indiana, there was a huge ammunition plant. Today, most of that property has turned into like Amazon fulfillment center and kind of an industrial park. But there was this big ammunition plant, right? But after wartime, you don't really need those anymore, right? After wartime, you don't need these big factories making all this ammunition because you're not using it, you're not in war. So you'd shut those factories down. But what the government does is it maintains some of those. So it would be really subtle, right? They would probably, almost kind of let them break down a little bit on the outside so that people wouldn't realize that's what was there. But they would maintain these factories internally so that if we would ever go into that sort of crisis again, we would need these things. we wouldn't need to spend all this time building these factories. They would be ready to go. And we could turn them on and we could turn out a whole bunch of ammunition all at once if we got into that situation. Well, I know that was a long story, but that is what a memory B cell basically is. Right? So your body gets this infection the first time. We call it a primary immune response. Right? And what happens is we've got to build these factories. So there's a little bit of a delay, right? You get sick, and your adaptive immune system has to sort of build up a response that then it can unleash and get rid of that illness. So let's say primary response, let's say you're sort of sick for 7 to 10 days. First couple days not so bad, then you feel bad for 3 days and you stay home from school, and then you got a couple more days where you're still trying to get your energy back and stuff. But here's what your body will do, right? It won't get rid of those factories, right? It'll keep these factories for later. And so if you get that again, we're going to call that over here on the left a secondary response. If that same invader decides to try to come back into your body, you've already got factories, right? So this is going to be much quicker and much stronger. I know this is really hard to read. Much quicker and much stronger than the primary response, the initial response. In fact, you may not even ever feel sick. So this might be something more like a 2 to 3 day response. And so maybe, you start to feel a little weak or tired, so you just go to bed early, and then you're right back at it, right? And it's because those memory B cells and memory T cells were already there, and they can mount an immune response way more quickly. Now, I put another little unit homework alert. This is going to be part of your review questions as well. And this is kind of a look at vaccines for just a moment. I didn't feel like I needed a whole nother slide for this, but this whole adaptive immune response idea is the reason why you only get some diseases once, like chickenpox, or in your all's case, you have a shot for that now, so you probably never even had chickenpox. But when I was a kid, that was really common, right? You get chickenpox once, and then you won't get it again. And that's because there's only really one type of virus that causes chickenpox. So once you've had it once, your immune system is ready for it. This is how a vaccine works, right? A vaccine works by exposing you to an antigen. It exposes you to that antigen so that your body mounts a little bit of an immune response. Now, hopefully, if it's done right, it doesn't cause you to get the disease, right? But it puts that antigen in your body so that if that antigen ever comes back in the form of an actual invader, your body will destroy it before you ever get sick. And this is why we get vaccines. This is why we get the MMR shot, right? This is why we get a number of shots, hopefully when we're kids. And it helps provide immunity from, infection. Now, if you think about the flu shot, what we put in there each year is antigens or proteins from kind of like 3 to 5 main types of flu virus that we think are going to be common, or the CDC thinks are going to be common. There's more types than that, though, right? So if you get a flu shot, it will protect you from the types of influenza virus that the shot's supposed to protect you from. But then sometimes there's just other types of flu out there. Now, if you look at the coronavirus, and we'll talk about this more later, it's the same idea. If we could create a vaccine for this, it would be specific to this type of coronavirus. So you could still get other kinds of viruses, right? But this vaccine hopefully would expose you to an antigen, allow you to develop an immune response so that if the real pathogen ever comes into you, you kill it. All right. So that's enough for now. Sorry I went on a long time on this last slide. But our next step is to start getting into specific infectious diseases, and I think you're going to find that to be particularly interesting.